Well, I might do our official introduction to Lorna now. No doubt a few more people will be popping in, but in the interests of roughly keeping to time, please welcome Professor Lorna Piatti-Farnell. She is Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at Auckland University of Technology, where she is also the Director of the Popular Culture Research Centre. In addition, she's president of the Gothic Association of New Zealand and Australia, which I'm also a part of, and she's the coordinator of the Australasian Horror Studies Network, which I'm also a part of. Please join up if you haven't already. Professor Piatti-Farnell's research interests lie at the intersection of film, popular media and cultural history, and include a focus on corporeality, horror, technology and bioethics, disability, eco-environmentalism, and superheroes and the Gothic. She's published widely in these areas, including volumes such as Consuming Gothic, Food and Horror in Film, Gothic Afterlives, Reincarnations of Horror in Film and Popular Media, 2019, and the Superhero Multiverse, Readapting Popular Icons in 21st Century Film and Popular Media. We'd also like to welcome Lorna as an adjunct professor at Curtin. This is her first presentation for us since joining the team. So please, a big welcome. We're so thrilled to have you on board at Curtin. And without further ado, please welcome Lorna and her presentation, The Metal and the Flesh, Exploring Superheroes, Disability and Transhuman Liminalities in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Take it away, Lorna.
Thank you, Gwyneth, for a very generous introduction, a very warm welcome indeed. I definitely do feel appropriately welcomed. I'd also would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Katie Ellis for inviting me to give this presentation today as part of the CCAT network. So as my title suggests, today I am going to be discussing the relationship between disability and superheroes in the films and episodic media of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, also known affectionately as the MCU. And I will preface this by saying that that relationship can be very complex and multifaceted, especially in the ways in which disability is represented, at times very problematic. There are also a few contradictions peppered throughout the narratives in terms of representation, so that might come through today as well as we look at a few examples. And while considering a few examples from the wider MCU today, I will focus particularly on the figure of Bucky Barnes. There he is, the eponymous Winter Soldier of several narratives, as an evocative case study for discussing intersecting notions of disability as markers of identity. Now, in the case of Bucky, I hope to show the idea of disability is particularly shown as existed with complicated notions of fear, of otherness and monstrosity, and the idea of humanity as well as transhumanity and posthumanity as slippery and contested epistemological areas. Now, in considering Bucky's body in particular as part of disability discourses, I will view the superhero's body overall as an uncanny and suggestively grotesque entity, even within the context that superheroes regularly inhabit. Now, all these terms that I'm using evoke a number of representations, and I know that a lot of ideas might have been popping into everyone's head as I mentioned them. And overall, I'm hoping to look at the connections in relation to understandings of disability as part of cultural discourses that inevitably and regrettably at times uncover the very idea of difference as the source of unease and often mistrust. Now, it's a little bit of setting the scene exercise for today. I'm going to be focusing primarily, as I said, on the cinematic and media context, leaving discussions of comics, of Marvel comics, for a different occasion. There are some similarities, but also some fundamental differences in the ways in which superheroes and their narratives and their identities and their struggles and their bodies are represented in the comics as they are in the cinematic universe. So, you know, comics deserve their own look, and we will leave that for a different time. I would also leave, for the most part, discussions of disability as connected to the superhero body in the DC cinematic universe for a different occasion and for future scholarship. So sorry, DC fans, but I promise there will be a few mentions here and there just to make sure we maintain an equitable relationship. Now, equally, I will leave discussions and representations of neurodivergence in the superhero context for a different occasion. There is a growing body of literature on this particular topic, and it's a very complex area that deserves to be given appropriate scholarly attention in its own right. So I will talk about that on a different occasion. So let's get right into it, talking about the MCU and the fame of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a repository for fantastical superhero exploits is indeed undeniable. And yet, within the folds of the MCU's many larger than life transmedia storylines hides the presence of tortured and haunted figures, often sitting at the cusp between human and machine, human and animal, and human and alien. Indeed, experimental biotechnologies are regularly associated with the creation and feats of the superheroes and the superhumans, particularly, within this particular narrative universe. Now, the terms disability and superheroes seem to be, at least as far as the popular conception goes, profoundly at odds with each other. At least I've been told they are on multiple occasions. And while both concepts resist a conclusive definition and draw strength from the ontological malleability that goes with their representation, presentation, and usage, they appear to be, at least on the surface, diametrically opposed. Obviously, I'll be arguing differently today, as you can imagine. Indeed, disability and superheroes find a very fertile ground in media representation, as they're both notions that rely in one way or the other on depictions of excess. Now, Rosemary Garland Thompson suggests that disability can be seen as both a social construction and a lived experience. It exists in the spaces of the out of scale and works as a violation of the normal and expected. It is a little bit of a flamboyant claim, but it kind of gives us a suggestion towards how we can see that connection, between, like the excessive superheroes and the dimensions of disability coming together. Equally, superheroes are figures that very rarely get evaluated in terms of normality, however contested and contestable that term can actually be. There is no denying that the very label of superhero in particularly is generally culturally associated with notions of physical superiority, intellectual superiority in a number of cases, but I will focus particularly on the physical aspect today. And that physical superiority is always inevitably connected to complicated notions of perfection, aspiration, and even desirability. Now, the physically enhanced bodies of superheroes often lie at the center of their difference and function as the source of their exceptionality and extraordinary qualities. Now, superheroes are across the board always, in one way or the other, considered to be exceptional, especially when that physicality is concerned. Now, hyperbole, Garland Thompson goes out to say, is an inevitable part of superhero representation. Superhero narratives, in turn, she argues, make a welcome home for mutants, monsters, freaks, and all manners of people with disabilities, even if the characters themselves have difficulty being reconciled with their status. And that difficulty of being reconciled is one of the aspects that I will be discussing today, especially when we place a focus on Bucky Barnes. It is then within this dialogical space that discussions of disability become particularly salient, as the superhero's ostensive physical perfection is also exposed as inevitably entangled with ideas of ableism, where understandings of what is normal, in inverted commas, and what is either exceptional or perhaps substandard, again in inverted commas, mingle and merge. Now, a note on this whole approach, some members of our audience today may be very familiar with the critical discussions over disability and superheroes. So if you are, this contextualization, in terms of a critical understanding may seem superfluous, and the connection between the two terms may seem obvious. Overall, in superhero studies, and perhaps in broader terms within popular culture studies as well, and perhaps even media and cultural understandings, the connection between disability and superheroes is not quite so obvious, hence the desire to clarify the approach that I'm taking today. There are actually a number of disability portrayals we'll see in the MCU, and I will mention just a few today as salient and quite evocative examples. Now, historically, superhero narratives in both comics and other media have, and I quote Otherness and Smith here, typically represented disability in terms in limited and stereotypical ways, much like other contemporary entertainments. Now, it is very important to recognize that representations of disability in superhero narratives can be very problematic, and it's not by chance that I opened with that today, especially when disability is inevitably presented as an impaired status and something that must be either healed or alleviated or erased in ways that undermine the realities of actually living with impairment. A salient example of this representation can be found in the X-Men films, which were produced between 2000 and 2014, and which are now part of the broader and extended Marvel Cinematic Universe. They weren't at the time because Marvel Studios had lost the rights, to making X-Men movies, but they have regained them now. So we are looking at, the X-Men as part of the broader MCU. Yeah, we see them just as a little touch of nostalgic attachment. Now, here in this particular narrative, mutation is viewed with unease and even fear by unmutated humans. And for those of you who don't know, they might have guessed it, the X-Men are a group of mutated individuals that display a variety of additional abilities. And those abilities bestowed by mutation vary greatly from individual to individual and include, among others, the power to physically regenerate at heightened speed. And, a little nod to Wolverine there. Walk through walls, teleport, morph into animal shapes, and even read minds. Now, while mutants possess abilities that well exceed the bounds of the human, they're not quite considered in the same terms as other super individuals will be in the wider Marvel, superhero context, with examples such as Captain America, which we will discuss a little bit later on today. The mutations are regarded as a form of impairment and at times even as a disease that must be cured one way or the other. This is hinted at in multiple times throughout the X-Men films and openly discussed in X-Men The Last Stand, where medical efforts to extensively cure mutation are pursued by human unmutated scientists. Far from making them special, inverted commas, a term that often gets mentioned when talking about superheroes, and placing them in a desirable, even aspirational position, as powers often do in the superhero world. The physical differences displayed by the mutants in the X-Men films mark them as different, unacceptable and unaccepted culturally and socially. A particularly evocative example can be found in the figure of Cyclops, played by James Marsden, who shoots energy bolts from his eyes and can only open them while wearing mitigating goggles on pain of injuring and even killing others. Now, without the goggles, Cyclops becomes actually physically impaired because he must keep his eyes closed at all times. You will have guessed it, Cyclops is a source of fear among unmutated humans, and viewers are presented with a full extent of the damage that his mutations can do when his, in inverted commas, disability is not managed, needs to be managed and kept under control, or at least the control of unmutated humans. Now, while the mutant metaphor, and there's again a lot of scholarship on this if you're interested in looking into it, has been interpreted in several ways as a way to explore gender, race, and even sexuality, it is not difficult to see how it also can function as a veiled critique for disability, with the latter being portrayed as an experience of divergence and cultural marginality, which generates fear and confusion among those who encounter it. This depiction is, of course, highly lamentable, but not necessarily a single instance in the superhero world. Disability within the superhero genre is marked, as Hardin and Kiernan remind us, by a layer of deficit discourses, which are based on one-dimensional social sanction narratives of diagnosis and recovery. It might also be worth remembering, of course, that the X-Men films are also depict a very clearer, so to speak, expression of physical disability as embodied in Professor X, played by Patrick Stewart, the powerful leader of the X-Men, who possesses incredible telepathic powers and also has paraplegia. Now, as a side note, or perhaps a little bit of a consideration in parentheses, shall we say, this is not something that I will be discussing directly today, but part of the difficulty in understanding notions of disability in the superhero world in general, and in particular in the MCU, stems particularly from the historical tendency in the broader spectrum of film, media, and popular culture to mark what was presented as physically different from the norm, the perceived norm, as either lacking, as either not only lacking, but particularly as villainous and somehow less than human. This approach has also been historically reinforced within superhero narratives, in particular with the ongoing stereotype of the supervillain, where forms of disability or disfigurement, so perceived, are often used as central indications of expected wrongdoing. Now, in his analysis of film and media and television in particular, Martin Norden suggests that physical impairment and disfigurement have long provided basic physical markers of evil that rely upon and magnify, and I quote, the able-bodied fear of disability. In the world of superhero films, supervillains who are seemingly defined by their disabilities abound. There are many examples, and I'm sure you can think of quite a few even beyond, the superhero world. The physical differences are often perceived as scary and repulsive, and a clear indication of the character's evil temperament, almost like a visible projection of their wrongdoing. That's usually how it's treated, lamentably, once again. A famous example of this would be perhaps the representation of the Penguin as seen in Batman Returns in the DC universe. Here we see him portrayed by Danny DeVito in that particular film. Now, the connection between disability, disfigurement, and villainy in the superhero genre seems almost a foregone conclusion as far as the narratives are concerned, forsaking absence and non-representation in favor of murderous intent and chaotic behavior. I'm going to close that parenthesis on villains and return to superheroes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While not necessarily framed within disability discourses in the traditional sense, there are indeed multiple instances in the MCU where superheroes are viewed through a lens of difference and surrounded by mistrust and feelings of unease. This is particularly connected to the inevitable transformation and changes to their bodies and the related identity status that goes with them, which openly exceeds the bounds of humanity. I'm thinking here of examples such as Bruce Banner and his Hulk alter ego, played in the MCU, of course, by Mark Ruffalo, as well as Wanda Maximoff and her Avengers persona as the Scarlet Witch, played by Elizabeth Olsen. Now, both are seen as too powerful and too uncontrollable to integrate into the human everyday world. And to some extent, these characters, and I will talk about them a little bit more in one moment, these characters can be seen as not fitting the broader definition of cultural normality and can therefore be perceived as other. Now, I use this term, and I know I mentioned it before, in its cultural understandings, and I know it can be very problematic, but here I'm sort of like gesturing towards its meaning in relation to that which is different from the perceived norm and possibly generating fear and discomfort precisely because of that. Now, the Hulk with his overly large green body is in one way other from the start. Filled with rage and regularly unable to control his emotions, it represents a destructive threat. One can see here hints at what can be framed as a form of emotional disability, becoming uncontrollably conducive to forms of physical uncontrollability as well. Now, in spite of his deniable superhero status within the Avengers, the Hulk is also feared. This is tacitly acknowledged several times throughout the metaplot and in multiple films. Now, this condition of fear and somewhat uncontrollable nature is seemingly resolved unexpectedly later in the narrative arc of the character, when, as seen in Avengers Endgame, Bruce Banner is shown as having found balance between himself and the Hulk, where the two coexist via what is suggesting to be a set of controlling techniques. I won't talk anymore about the Hulk, but you can see that even just describing, like the interaction that is happening between, like his sort of like dualistic nature, kind of like their gestures towards the monstrous, and of course a very regrettable representation of his emotional, like disability overall. Now, equally, Wanda Maximoff as the Scarlet Witch, with her abilities to control chaos magic, who wouldn't want to do that, is a very powerful individual who can cause destruction and death at the blink of an eye. Although not perceived to be evil, well, arguably kind of like oscillates between the two. As such, the Scarlet Witch is also viewed with fear by common individuals, inverted commas. Her powers are a clear mark of difference that sets her apart from society and makes her unable, for the most part, to integrate into everyday life. It is made clear that Wanda is just too different, too removed from what is seen as culturally acceptable to be allowed to be in the normal world. Although body does not display any type of physical impairment as such by showing, say, for instance, the loss of a limb, she is impaired by her superpowers. Wanda is still viewed as abnormal, one might say, because of her body and mind's abilities to generate a power that is well beyond the reach of ordinary humans. Now, here we see the definition of disability also tacitly being stretched and molded to fit the social politics of super individuals, which always sit a little bit outside of the ordinary, whatever ordinary may be perceived to be. Now, as a dearly departed friend, Justin Edwards, puts it, the abnormal body is an agent of the monster human that elevates the perceived normal body and clearly marks out the parameters of acceptability. Now, it is worth mentioning here that both Bruce Banner and Wanda Maximoff in the MCU gained their powers through techno-scientific and quasi-mystical experimentation, which, although connected to notions of enhancement within the narrative, placed them in a socially and culturally impaired status within the human framework. Now, overall, it is not uncommon to see superhero narratives playing with notions of transhumanity and posthumanity. Now, the concept of transhumanity is founded in the idea that the human race can be ostensibly improved by exceeding and overcoming, its perceived physical and mental limitations by means of science and technology. As a movement, transhumanism explores notions of enhancement. The posthuman, on the other hand, is a concept that is focused on exploring the very nature of what it means to be human. Studies within posthumanism particularly focus on the cultural fears and anxieties that result from what is often seen as perhaps inevitable forms of evolution and change caused by, for example, the application of transhuman improvements, scientific experimentation, and technological recreations of consciousness, from cyborgs to artificial intelligence, and biogenetic occurrences such as mutation. Now, there are, of course, and this is an important footnote, there are, of course, these are very broad overviews of the two terms / movements. And there are intricacies within both and intersections between both, which make overarching definitions quite challenging. However, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to go with these definitions, in the background as we use these terms. Now, bestowed as it is with incredible superpowers and often unnatural strength and longevity, the superhero body exceeds the perceived limitations of the human flesh, regularly surpassing it, leaving the limits of the ordinary Homo sapiens body behind. Unavoidable traces of posthumanism can clearly be seen not only in the X-Men, but also in Captain America storylines within the MCU, with discussions of humanity, transhumanity, and posthumanity often being the center of attention. They're not referred to in those terms, but the concepts that are being, sort of like put under the telescope definitely point in that direction. Now, this is definitely a constant focus in Captain America, the First Avenger, and all the way throughout the MCU to series such as The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which I will be discussing later today, where the ethics of bodily enhancement are particularly discussed. Which brings me to Bucky Barnes. Now, just a little biographical note, shall we say, for those who are not familiar with Bucky. And for those who are familiar with Bucky, just a little reminder of who he is. Now, Bucky Barnes, played by Sebastian Stan in the MCU, is known as the childhood friend and later army companion of Steve Rogers, also known as Captain America. During the years of World War II, Bucky was believed to have died during a mission led by Captain America by falling off a moving train and into a cliff. This is shown in the events of the First Avenger, where he very dramatically falls, to what is believed to be his death. It is later revealed that Bucky didn't perish in the fall and was found by Soviet/Hydra scientists. While Bucky did not die, he did, however, lose his left arm, which was damaged beyond healing. This resulted in the surgical addition of his iconic metal arm to replace the organic arm that was lost. And there it is. Now, after he was captured by Hydra, Bucky was also administered a version of the super soldier serum, now very famous and talked about. This is a chemical solution that was designed by Abraham Erskine to enhance the human body with the idea of creating resilient and almost indestructible super soldiers. A similar version of the serum was given by the American military to Steve Rogers to make him, what would later become Captain America, in what was a very quick and very dramatic transformation as seen in the first Avenger. So he goes from one to the other in a matter of minutes. For Bucky, as you can see, the muscles are very unavoidable. Now, for Bucky, the serum yielded similar effects to those witnessed in Steve by giving him great strength, great agility, minus perhaps the overbearing, bulging muscles. Now, it is worth recalling here that before taking the super soldier serum, Steve Rogers was amply seen and referred to as being weak and unfit to serve in the US Army. However, after the serum is administered and his body is suddenly endowed with superhuman strength and agility, he's quickly considered to be the perfect specimen, physically speaking, at least. A clear link is built here between physical prowess and cultural notions of superiority, stressing the idea that when it comes to depictions of bodies and identities in the superhero world, great emphasis is placed on the body and how he fails to achieve or even exceed expectations. Although pre-procedure Steve is not considered as being physically disabled, perhaps in the traditional sense, tacit notions of impairment float around his characterization, as his non-muscular body is continuously framed over and over as substandard and simply not good enough, especially when compared to the perfect, so conceived nature of his post-procedure physique. And let's enjoy another couple of pictures of Chris Evans in the role of Captain America, because why not? Now, notions of perfection are not so clearly delineated, however, when it comes to Bucky's body. After the train accident and his capture by Hydra, the metal arm becomes one of the most recognizable characteristics of Bucky in his guises as the Winter Soldier, a secret entity who acts as Hydra's assassin for over 70 years and who is granted an unnaturally long age by being cryogenically frozen between missions. Bucky's identity and memories are regularly erased. We are told that he gets subjected to painful brainwashing procedures to ensure his compliance, and his mind can be controlled by reciting a particular sequence of words. From the onset, the experience of Bucky as the Winter Soldier is characterized by a mixture of lack of consent, suffering, torture, trauma, and loss. This does not come too much of a surprise, of course, as Jungru reminds us, a mainstay of the superhero narrative or the superhuman narrative in general across mediums and platforms is the notion of heroism paired with extraordinary ability as a compensation for trauma, injury, and even impairment. And there are multiple examples, that fall into this category, and it is very recurrent. One famous example, of course, being Batman in that sense, even though when it comes to Batman, the label of super has been widely discussed and contested, but such as it is. Later in the films of the MCU, such as Captain America Civil War, Bucky will be liberated from his forced imprisonment as the Winter Soldier, thanks to his eventual reunion with Steve Rogers and the help of the Avengers. While the super soldier serum transformed Bucky's body into a physically superior entity, so to speak, the addition of the metal arm and the lack of his organic arm becomes one of the most discussed aspects of his character, and one that is regularly focused upon as a point of contention. While he possesses superhuman strength and is a formidable fighter, it is made clear that Bucky is looked upon with considerable suspicion and fear. This is not only in view of the fact that he was mentally manipulated by Hydra to be subservient and without morals for decades, but also because of his physical unwholeness as it is framed. The superbody in this context is exposed as a product of elaborate determination, where any deviation from the expected norm is seen as unfitting and undesirable. While ostensibly presented the vast majority of superhero characteristics, as we discussed, pretty much the same as Steve Rogers, like in general terms, Bucky is often not considered in these terms, even when he joins the Avengers officially in the fight against Thanos, as seen in Avengers Infinity War. It becomes clear that Bucky's physical disability is regularly equaled with his mental disability, and while he is called upon to fight, the lack of his arm constantly marks him as different. During his recovery time in Wakanda, once he's freed from Hydra, as the guest of King T'Challa, aka Black Panther, played by the lamented Chadwick Boseman, Bucky is often shown living a peaceful existence when he is open about the lack of his organic arm and does not wish to wear any form of prosthetic, metal or otherwise. However, that doesn't last very long. It soon becomes clear that a superhero cannot be a superhero, so to speak, if he's lacking an arm. And Bucky is gifted a brand new bionic arm, metal arm by the Wakandans so that he can fight as expected. There he is, all shiny and new. And of course, you guessed it, he never asked for it, and he never really wanted to wear it, and he never really wanted to fight, but he wasn't given a choice once again. Or if he was, he didn't take it. Now, the connection between disability, difference, and a superhero's body is particularly unknown in the MCU, and especially so in the case of Bucky, as he is interlinked with discussions of technology and perceived improvement. Overall, it's somewhat unsurprising to see a link between technology and prosthetics as connected to broader conceptualizations of enhancement for the super individual, especially if one considers the military context that both Bucky Barnes and Steve Rogers inhabit. Now, Scott Jeffrey suggests that prosthetics carry a clear cultural and practical link to disability. However, in a military context, they're also the most commonly raised technology as far as the rehabilitation, restoration, and improvement, as he puts it, of the soldier's body is concerned. Of course, the term prosthetics here is taken in the broadest possible definition of the term. As he is made clear in the MCU, Bucky is considered to be lacking, somewhat lacking as a soldier, as he only has one organic arm. The addition of his prosthetic arm not only makes him whole, so to speak, but also clearly improves his performance, as a metal arm is stronger and more efficient than any organic human arm could ever be. The metal arm is not simply a replacement, it is an enhancement, which further upgrades his status from soldier to super soldier. The two notions of impairment and enhancement seem to be strangely at odds here, but coexist in reconceptualized transhuman discourse of presence and absence. Indeed, the coexistence of flesh and metal parts highlights Bucky's body as a liminal entity and exposes a central preoccupation with the idea of transhuman augmentation when it comes to the impaired body, both within and outside the bounds of the superhero context. Now, transhumanism is, of course, a contentious ethical discourse. As he suggests, among other things, the possibility that human beings may deliberately desire to upgrade existing organic limbs, for instance, with enhanced prosthetic ones. And this opens the way for convoluted ethical discussions with undeniable futuristic undertones. And while Bucky's physical disability is generally viewed as unacceptable and marks him, regrettably, as substandard as a soldier, the prosthetic metal arm is seen as a welcome addition, which not only allows Bucky to function in his role as a soldier, physically speaking, but also makes him an incredible weapon in combat. In Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man, played by Tim Holland, even goes as far as defining the metal arm as cool, as he gazes upon it in amazement. While transhuman changes can fall in a tricky ethical area, the transhuman enhancement to Bucky's body via the addition of a high-tech prosthetic is viewed as acceptable, desirable even, in the military context at least. Not fully trustworthy, but definitely cool nonetheless. However, it soon becomes very obvious that without the metal arm, Bucky's sense of worth quickly disappears. This is seen in an episode of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, when the prosthetic metal arm obviously is unexpectedly removed with a series of pressure point moves by the skilled Wakandan soldier Ayo, played by Florence Kazumba, in the midst of a fight. She does these really cool things, they're fighting, like he's feeling really good about himself, he's getting the upper hand, and then she applies these pressure points and the arm literally drops to the floor. Like it just falls off, and Bucky truly was not expecting to be disarmed in such a fashion, literally and metaphorically. He clearly did not know that there was a failsafe, and his look of shock and subsequent helplessness at the removal of the arm speaks loudly about his own relationship with his disability. He feels disempowered, feels useless, and unable to continue in the fight. Indeed, the view of disability that is imbued into the narrative here continues to reinforce negative stereotypes about physical impairment in the superhero narrative. There is very little negotiation of Bucky's physical disability, except for the fact that it needs to somehow be overcome, and if exposed, it is a source of shame and emotional pain. It is worth mentioning here that Bucky also displays various symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. He constantly experiences flashbacks of his missions and everything that he has been through. As a Winter Soldier, he struggles to sleep and generally fails to establish meaningful relationships that would allow him to lead what it will be seen in that context as a normal life. This is particularly shown in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, witnessing PTSD symptoms here is not too much of a surprise, as unfortunately this is a common occurrence in soldiers within a context of war and conflict. Bucky's soldier PTSD, however, is also intrinsically linked to his physical disability, as the lack of his organic arm is a constant reminder of his past by which he is forever haunted. To some extent, trauma here also functions as a further form of disability for Bucky, as he impairs his ability to integrate into society and feel accepted. Now, the disability of Bucky's body is made visible, but paradoxically remains unaddressed in a proactive or helpful way. Moments of grace for Bucky will only come in the final episodes of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series, when he is seen as somewhat, to some extent, accepting that his disability and metal prosthetic do not define his identity. This, however, comes quite late in the narrative and is left unresolved for the most part, providing a little bit of a disappointing development in his character arc, at least as it stands. Overall, Bucky's physical impairment is fetishized as a means to achieve enhancement, and the narrative does not offer many opportunities to deterritorialize the very concept of disability itself outside of notions of lack. Now, the process of experimentation and physical enhancement, the processes, shall we say, that construct Bucky's narrative, especially in relation to his metal arm, place a focus on surgery as an agent of difference. Now, in modes and genres such as Gothic and horror, it is common to see the very act of surgery actualized as part of a suggestively frightening narrative. Surgery becomes a conduit for transgression and the embodiment of fear in the flesh. Indeed, as Xavier Aldana Reyes suggests, horror narratives often employ a thorough exploitation of surgical nightmares. And this screenshot here is actually the moment when Bucky wakes up after the surgery that gave him his metal arm and, like administered to him the super soldier serum, which of course he did not consent to, and he wakes up to confusion and fear and basically no knowledge at all about what has happened to his body. Of course, the horror dimension of surgical procedures is not generally part of the superhero narrative, as its science fiction inspired developments regularly tend to frame surgical and experimental procedures on the body as the source of awe and amazement. That's certainly the way that, the transformation of Steve Rogers' body is actually looked at, of look what we've done, look what we have managed to achieve, isn't this fantastic? In the case of Bucky, however, the forceful inclusion of elements of torture and lack of consent transforms procedures of transhuman enhancement and through surgery and other biotechnological means into an alienating and utterly scary narrative. While there is a suggestion, of course, that all super bodies in the wider Marvel Cinematic Universe are, in inverted commas, abnormal to some extent, there is undeniable fear around Bucky as a somewhat devious entity that exceeds even the bounds of superhumanity via notions of both transhuman and posthuman transformation. As a super enhanced yet disabled soldier, Bucky is a figure of excess. He exceeds the bounds of humanity and becomes a hybrid figure, somewhere between human and machine. In its grotesque guises, Bucky's liminal disabled body renders, to borrow Aldana Reyes' words, our fears of difference and marginalization, while also laying bare the impositional structures of biopolitics. It is precisely these politicized conceptions that drive our understanding of the superbody in a biotechnological, bioexperimental context, and inevitably define superhumanity itself as a difference-driven label. Now, it might be worth remembering here, en passant, that the treatment of Bucky's metal limb and body overall is not the first instance where particularly MCU's Captain America films make haunting bodily transformation, haunting bodily transformations to signal the inherent otherness of particular characters. One should only think here of the evocative example of the Red Skull, aka Johann Schmidt, played by Hugo Weaving, who had also taken a non-proofed version of the enhancing super soldier serum. However, he had quite a different effect on him, as we see in, like the transformation happen on screen in the first Avenger. We witnessed the horrific changes of Schmidt's face and body into what can only be defined as a grotesque entity whose shriveled and discolored skin unavoidably marks him as the villain within the narrative and challenges the very concept of humanity within the story. Indeed, as the Red Skull himself says mockingly to Steve Rogers, as Captain America at some point in the film, you are just afraid to admit that we have left humanity behind. And speaking of leaving humanity behind, in its conceptualization as an agent of biohorror, The technologically enhanced superbody can be interpreted as both transhuman and posthuman, not only in virtue of its reliance on biomechanical manipulation and improvement of the human form, but also because of its place in debate over the limits of human identity. The biotechnological qualities of Bucky's metal arm most certainly place him in the broader cybernetic category and add a complex layer to the representation of his disability. By exhibiting both organic and biomechanical materials, the cyborg, as Patricia McCormack contends, speaks to a post-human future that is set on achieving liberation from the flesh. Now, the flesh in question is, of course, the human flesh. Indeed, the obvious coexistence of flesh and metal parts in Bucky's body evocatively bring to the surface preoccupations over both humanity and superhumanity that compromise the certainty of boundaries and identities. Now, while posthumanism seemingly aims or discusses the erasure and removal of the constraints of the flesh, however, it would appear that the flesh is a central aspect of the techno-posthuman condition, especially when ideas of disability become part of the discussion. That is to say, the shadows of the flesh, at least as far as Bucky is concerned, are constantly there in both consciousness and unconsciousness, even when it is removed in favor of cybernetic materials. The more we try to forget about the flesh, it would seem, and repress its importance, the more it returns in a rather uncanny way. And as far as Bucky is concerned, it is precisely his difficult negotiations with his own body that show us the persistent ubiquitousness of the flesh. His metal arm is a constant reminder of what is perceived as his inevitable difference. The lack of the organic limb reinforces Bucky's liminality, even more than his metal arm does. The hybridity of his body speaks to the impact of the flesh, and as such, the missing flesh haunts the narrative and Bucky's experience overall in the MCU. Now, allow me some final remarks by way of conclusion. Oh, yes. Across the board, superheroes allow us, as Garland Thompson suggests, to depart from the restrictions of the flesh, from the anchor in the mud that is normalcy, and to enter the realms of the improbable, to make new stories about human experience. And of course, the contention always is, the argument always is, that whenever we are discussing superhumanity and everything connected to it in the superhero context, the metaphorical focus truly is on humanity. That's really what we want to discuss, and superheroes provide an apt framework for that. The superheroes from the wider MCU show a veiled affinity to proposing the body as a point of focus for the definition of identity in an ever-changing world. Superheroes are, by definition, creatures of difference, not only because of their heightened fighting abilities, but also because of their enhanced bodies, which are recurrently made so by the use of biotechnologies, often with genetically modifying effects, as it is the case, for instance, of Captain America and Bucky Barnes. Now, while most superheroes in the MCU are still ostensibly human, they are often forever changed, as their bodies are provocatively improved, in inverted commas, beyond the abilities of the ordinary human being. Even when the changes are not technically physiological, technology is still at the center of ideas of improvement, as is seen in the case of Iron Man, which wears this spectacular suit that allows him to do to accomplish incredible feats, including flying. In the MCU, the super body is not simply understood in biological terms, of course, but is also presented, unsurprisingly somewhat, as a deeply rooted sociocultural entity, which, in spite of its perceived superiority, is still expected to operate within the limits of the ordinary human rules and regulations, which is why they struggle, because well, they're not particularly ordinary, whatever ordinary may mean in that context. Within this, any challenge to the integrity of the body caused by, for instance, the loss of a limb is a direct confrontation of that very idea of perfection that constructs the superhero in both narrative and cultural terms, at least as far as the physical representation is concerned. Explorations of disability in the MCU, as tacit or as explicit as they may be, also draw attention to the qualities that make up the human as both organic matter and as a social, cultural, and political entity. The body of the superhero, and even more so that of the surgically enhanced superhero, oscillates between humanity and otherness, precisely because of its physiological liminality. The techno-enhanced body, especially when the enhancement is represented by prosthetics, pushes the boundaries of cultural acceptability. As such, the intersection of discourses of disability, biotechnologies, and transhumanity in the superhero world provocatively uncovers the fears and anxieties that surround humans as corporeal entities, and our pervasive desire, so it would seem, to exceed the limitations of the flesh. Now I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and let's talk more.